Well, that was News at 10. Coming up, the press preview, including this story on the front of the Financial Times. Apoplectic Trump vented his fury at Boris Johnson over that Huawei decision, their headline. Well, tonight we're joined by the senior editor at Novara Media, Ash Sarkar, and the reporter at Guido Fawkes, Tom Harwood. That is coming up next. So Ash and Tom are here to bring us your thoughts. No doubt we'll get some more papers in as well. And you want to start with the Telegraph about the police. People have given up, effectively.
So this is the front page of the Telegraph for tomorrow morning. They're leading on the fact that public confidence in the police is currently very, very low. It comes as there's been a 15% drop in police numbers in England and Wales overall, and that has resulted in fewer successful resolutions to crimes being reported, in particular things like burglary and car theft. So there's been a fivefold reduction in successful resolution of car theft cases in the last 5 years, which is really quite astonishing. But I think most worrying of all is that this has also had an impact on victims of crimes not feeling confident enough to go forward with cases. So they report a crime to the police, and over 40% of victims of rape who report then retract their allegation. They withdraw the case overall.
I mean, the difficulty is, and I'm sure we'll come on to the numbers of police officers in a moment, but the difficulty is that the nature of crime is also changing, is it not? With online and telephone fraud, for example, we know they've been looking at historic sexual allegations too. Is this simply that the role has almost got bigger for them?
Undoubtedly so, and obviously there are different types of crime to deal with as well. One of the shocking things about this article is that only 5.4% of thefts are actually resolved, actually end in a prosecution. And I'm sure anyone who's living in London has had a theft. I had a phone stolen the other...
I'm sorry about that, but I was broke that month.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and obviously they just sort of give up and they don't go after it. It's very frustrating. So it's clear why people seem to have a loss of faith there. But also it's important to make a distinction between the big cities and the rest of the country. Over the last year or so, violent crime has actually been falling in the rest of the country, but in places like London, it's been rising. So that's a very interesting distinction and something that really does need to be looked into.
I mean, it was reported many years ago that there is almost a check sheet, isn't there, about whether you get a fast response or not. I had a burglary when I lived in London. I thought the person was still inside and they came very quickly. That might have been a different case if I hadn't presumed I could hear footsteps inside. So we know that actually they've had to limit how they respond according to their own resources, haven't they?
Well, they've had to prioritise because there's like you said, crime has evolved. There's more complicated cases for police to address, and there's also been falls in police numbers. There's more to do with less manpower, and what that means is you're not going to be able to address everything as thoroughly as you ought to. There's also a huge amount of regional variety in terms of how victims of crime feel about the process of going to the police. So it can go from as low as 10% of reports resulting in police action to up to 20% in the neighbouring region. And so it's all about distribution of funding where resources are being put.
So police numbers then, Tom, one of the great promises, obviously, as we know, of Boris Johnson in his leadership campaign and in the election. How quickly and how swiftly and how reasonably can we expect those 21,000 police officers to be in place?
Well, the recruitment drive started before the election. It started on day one of Boris's premiership. The ads, I'm sure we've seen them all up on the side of police vans all around the country. And so people are being recruited and trained as we speak. But obviously it takes time to train up a police officer. What I would say is I don't think there's a direct correlation in terms of police numbers overall and crime rate. What we saw is actually as police numbers fell so slightly in the early coalition years, crime rate also fell. And it wasn't until around 2016, 2017 that the crime rate actually started to rise. And I think there is a distinction in between sort of frontline officers, community policing, and people who are still classed as police officers but are perhaps working in the back rooms. And I think it is so much more important to have a visible police presence out there on the streets, in amongst the communities. That is going to help decrease...
that actually feels like quite an old-fashioned argument now, I have to say. I mean, we've heard it for decades, haven't we? It's just, I'm not sure it's still possible, but...
You're right. It's not just numbers of police that result in greater or lesser numbers of crimes. It's a whole range of issues. So also when you've got standards of living falling, when you've got squeezes on wages, when you've got cutbacks to things like child protection and social care...
Wage growth is growing faster than inflation.
Wait a second. When you've also, in particular, got immense financial difficulties and pressures being put on things like child protection and social care, when you've got the social safety net, which is dealing with the most high-risk, troubled and vulnerable sections of society, and that's being cut back, then you do have a consequence of rising crime. And when you've got fewer resources to then deal with that crime, you then have a vicious circle of these things growing. And the reason why I talk so much about child protection is because I grew up amongst social workers. It was like being raised in the mafia. And one of the things which every single member of my family told me is that when it comes to serious cases of violence that they deal with in their community, quite often it's been committed by someone who's been through the system and has dropped out through the net at some point. So I think that there also has to be funding of that key early intervention work, which has unfortunately been defunded since the coalition years.
OK, let's move on, shall we? Front of the Financial Times, let's take a look at that. You want to talk about the SNP, a blow to the SNP after their finance minister had to quit.
Yes, this was quite the explosive scoop from the Scottish Sun last night, just hours before Derek Mackay, the Scottish Finance Minister, was going to give the budget for the SNP earlier today. He resigned after these explosive messages that he was sending to a 16-year-old schoolboy on social media, calling him words like cute, and sending repeated unanswered messages, really pestering, inviting this child out to see a football game, inviting him out to meet up in a way that a lot of people are viewing as quite seedy. And this dominated First Minister's questions in Holyrood today. It meant that the Finance Minister's deputy had to give the budget, and it is sending shockwaves through Scottish politics, and quite rightly so. It is an extraordinary situation where you have someone who's decades older than what is a child, and really trying to... you can see why the child's mother went to the press when she found out, and how this story has blown up to, quite rightly, the size it should be.
I mean, the volume of messages is just astonishing. When I first saw the news, I thought it was maybe a few inappropriate messages, and then reading this piece, it was 270 messages, and like you said, very pestering, very persistent, and even when the 16-year-old boy had said, look, I'm not really interested in anything, just continuing on with that kind of bombardment of messages. Sexual harassment in politics isn't anything new, but I think that one thing that social media has done has made it, one, easier for sleazy politicians to identify targets and have new avenues of communication to try and harass them, but also then in the opposite direction, for there to be evidence of that harassment and for there to be some semblance of accountability. We know that for decades this kind of thing has largely been swept under the carpet. It's been an open secret, not just in Westminster, but also in Holyrood, and now finally things are coming out. Hopefully that will mean a culture change.
And obviously this is in the context of the former First Minister Alex Salmond's trial next month, I believe, where he's facing a number of allegations of sexual assault, which of course he denies. But this is something that is really blowing open the Scottish National Party, a party that has for very many years tried to blame almost everything that's wrong in Scotland on Westminster. And when you get sort of issues like this that are very clearly nothing to do with politicians south of the border, it does make you think, is the shine starting to come off this party?
Yes, I'm sure the SNP would deny there's any systemic issue at all. But yes, no doubt we will cover the former First Minister's trial when it happens. Let's move on, shall we, to the coronavirus. The Metro talks about the third person who's tested positive here in the UK. We've had the overnight figures, haven't we, from Hubei province, Wuhan, obviously the epicentre of this, a further 69 deaths and nearly 2,500 new cases as well.
And interestingly, this Brit who has this third case in the UK, the person who contracted it did not come from China or Wuhan, it came from Singapore, which really does suggest that this is spreading. It's not contained in the way that the Chinese authorities would like it to be, and it is a big wake-up call that this is not going to be something that can be contained easily.
I mean, so the problem with coronavirus is that it's got a relatively long incubation period. So from the moment of transmission to when symptoms can be detected, that's a period of between 7 and 10 days, which for viruses is really quite a while, which means that in a highly integrated global society in which people are travelling around all the time for work, for leisure, it means that there's a lot of opportunities to transmit the virus. Now, when it comes to how worried Brits here should be, I think there's been an update of advice on the part of the Department of Health that you should self-isolate if you experience flu-like symptoms. But overall, coronavirus is not going to be more deadly in this country than the flu at this point. Still, coronavirus tends to be more fatal when there are existing what's called comorbidities. So if you've got a weakened immune system because of other illnesses you may have, or if you're diabetic and so on and so forth. So yes, it should be a cause for concern that transmission is occurring outside of China, but cases in the UK seem to be fairly contained for now.
And one individual story that many people have focused on is one of the whistleblowers who tried to warn the community about coronavirus and authorities as well. He was reprimanded by local police. He's pictured here, isn't he? Li Wenyang, 34, a doctor who was in fact interrogated, this paper says, by Chinese police after he raised the alarm. He has died in the hospital in Wuhan where he worked, and this is really sad.
It's absolutely devastating. And I think when it comes to the response of the Chinese state, there's going to be a lot of criticism in the way that they try to manage coronavirus as a PR issue first and foremost, controlling the flow of information rather than listening to healthcare professionals on the ground and heeding warnings early on.
And I think there is a big lack of trust now between states over this issue. The Chinese government were saying very definitely, don't know you can come to China, it's all fine, please don't institute travel bans. And Western countries have been pursuing those travel bans, and it is still UK government policy that no one should be visiting China unless they absolutely have to.
OK, well, we'll certainly monitor that, but the cases continue, as we heard there. Plenty more still to come, including the controversy over plans to fly Union flags for Prince Andrew's 60th birthday. That in just a couple of minutes. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, senior editor at Navarro Media, Ash Sarkar, and the reporter at Guido Fawkes, Tom Harwood. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go, shall we, to the Telegraph? And Bercow peerage scuppered by fresh claims, the paper says now.
This is the continuing protracted nature of the bullying claims, that dossier that we've been hearing about for weeks now, compiled by very senior people in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, compiling so many testimonies from people within Bercow's staff who have worked in and around and for him, and explaining and divulging his real anger problems and bullying problems, they allege, throughout his time as Speaker, to the extent that one of his staff had to be signed off with PTSD. And this piece here in the Telegraph is saying that it is now more likely than not that his peerage will be denied, a peerage proposed by Jeremy Corbyn for reasons unbeknownst to many, considering that he did not come from the Labour tradition, although was seen to be perhaps more kind towards the opposition benches than the government benches in recent years. But it is looking like his peerage attempts will be scuppered, which will be good news to many, many Conservatives.
And you will have heard his denials in an interview with Dermot Murnaghan this week, absolutely saying that the people who are accusing him are not true.
And he's consistently...
Blackmore did not work for him or in the same office or anything like that.
He's consistently denied these over the years as they've come up. But what's different now is the sheer volume, the sheer weight of evidence that's coming forward. The denials that John Bercow is continuing to say just sound less and less true.
So, I mean, one thing that I would say is that we don't know for certain whether these are true or whether it's not, but what we do know is that there is an endemic culture of bullying in Westminster. It's something of an open secret. I've talked to many junior staffers myself who've talked about appalling ways in which they've been treated, and it's something which goes across every single party line, every single faction. It does seem to be that there has been a toxic atmosphere which has been tacitly accepted from the top all the way down. And you can have situations in which an allegation may be true and it coming to light is politically motivated at the same time. It's no secret that John Bercow ended up being, really quite reviled by the government for what they see as his obstructive approach to Brexit's journey.
He says he took a different
Commons.
Interpretation to the government, yes.
And there were certainly a few on the opposition benches who would breathe a sigh of relief when John Bercow would make an intervention and allow them a little more time to try and find some kind of legislative way to outmaneuver the government. It seems to me that for as long as bullying allegations allegations, and the very serious allegations which are listed here, including sexually and racially inappropriate language, including, a really horrible, toxic workplace culture, as long as these things only surface at times where it's politically convenient, rather than through an independent process which has got some integrity to it, you are never going to have trust in the process from all sides of the Commons.
And of course, the flip side of that was when these comments first bubbled up in December of 2018 in the Commons, there was a big move to get rid of John Bercow, and many Labour politicians actually stood up and said, yes, it's terrible that there are all these accusations, but we need him in the chair because of Brexit. And I think
But was that not
really
a similar approach taken to Boris Johnson being leader of the Conservative Party? He said all these awful things about ethnic minorities, about pickaninnies with watermelon smiles, all these things which are in print. It's solid in there. Whereas the Conservative Party did say, well, you know what, he's the guy
from last century.
I think you absolutely can. I mean, when you say last century, it wasn't 100 years ago, darling.
It was before he was elected by a massive mandate within London. Everyone knows him to be on the very liberal end of the Conservative Party. No one.
OK, then in terms of letterboxes and bank robbers, what I'm saying is that where there are political motivations to keep your guy in a position of power so that your faction can be empowered, every single side of the Commons has done it.
To try and compare the Prime Minister, who has never had any of these sort of allegations against him, with the very serious allegations of bullying against John Bercow.
There actually was an allegation of groping, I believe, by a journalist, wasn't there?
We're running out. We've left the list of things. We'll perhaps do that one again. We were going to say about Prince Andrew and the flags. It's in the Sun, Daily Express. There we go. Flag for Andrew, demand ditched. They were going to fly the flag for his birthday, and the Daily Express as well. The suggestion there that he will be declining promotion to the rank of Admiral for the sake of the Queen, a promotion that was due on his 60th birthday. We'll see you at 11:30. Top stories are next. Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the senior editor at Levara Media, Ash Sarkar, and the reporter at Guido Fawkes, Tom Harwood. Welcome to both of you, good to see you. So let's take a look, shall we, at the front pages. The Guardian reporting that the third person who's tested positive for coronavirus in the UK is believed to have been infected in Singapore. The Eye says visitors from China and 8 other countries in Asia are being told to self-isolate if they develop a cough or a fever. It's the same story for the Metro. Virus Brit got bug in Singapore is their headline. Prince Andrew has agreed to turn down a senior Navy role following the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, according to the Daily Express. The Daily Mail reports that the teenager who pushed a boy off the top of Tate Modern revealed his murderous plans months earlier. The Daily Mirror has details of that plot to bomb a ferry in Northern Ireland on the night the UK left the European Union. Daily Telegraph reporting the public has given up on police due to their failure to investigate crimes. It's the same picture for The Times, the paper saying the relationship between the public and the police is eroding. Donald Trump vented apoplectic fury at Boris Johnson over the UK's decision to allow Huawei a role in its 5G mobile phone networks. That's the lead story for the Financial Times. And The Sun leads with a story about 2 stars from ITV's Loose Women. Daily Star carries claims from Michael Barrymore, who says he was bullied over the death of Stuart Lubbock. So Ash and Tom are here with their choices. And in fact, you want to delve inside the papers, don't you, for the very latest on what's happening with the Democratic race and Mr. Trump and his impeachment.
So we are still counting in the Iowa caucus. It feels like it's been going on about 20 years. I don't remember a time before the Iowa caucus. And apparently, Tom Perez, who is very senior in the DNC, is saying that there should be a recanvass of the vote, which is essentially a form of recount, which is slightly less arduous than a full recount, but a lot more arduous than simply releasing all of the results. With 97% of precincts reporting, Buttigieg is enjoying a 0.1% lead over Senator Sanders, which is very slim indeed. So, of course, this recanvass will be hotly contested. There's absolutely no love lost between Sanders and the Democrat establishment. There's very little trust. And so Sanders' campaign team had workers at the counts independently recording votes. And so he's saying that puts him 6,000 votes ahead. How that would work out in terms of state delegates, we don't know. But it's definitely a lot more of a long out than this needed to
Oh,
be.
it's time to move on, isn't it? Why don't they all just give up on Iowa? It doesn't contribute a lot to the Democratic convention. And just move on to New Hampshire and start again with the momentum and everything that you get from these first...
Right, and New Hampshire is done much more sensibly because it's a primary vote. It's a normal vote rather than people standing in rooms and moving into different parts of rooms.
So that's one person voting rather than you chat around and you decide on your candidate.
Exactly, and then you move on if someone is knocked out. And it's incredibly complicated and clearly horrifically carried out earlier this week in Iowa. And it does seem that all of this skirmishing now is just a prestige thing. It looks like Pete Buttigieg and Senator Sanders are going to walk away with the same...
the Mayor Pete man that we all hear
Exactly,
about.
which is... separately, he's had quite an extraordinary rise, going from a mayor of a small town in Indiana, about 100,000 people, to totally unknown. Most people in the United States couldn't pronounce his name. People in Britain are just about getting to it now. And he's suddenly gone to being right up at the top of the Democratic field. It's a very interesting candidacy, but it looks like he's going to walk away with the same number of delegates from Iowa as Sanders. And whether he's 1,000 or 2,000 votes ahead or 1,000, 2,000 votes behind, ultimately, it doesn't really matter because we're moving on to New Hampshire now.
The reason why this delay is so significant is that when that first caucus result comes in, and it's traditionally Iowa, that is a huge fundraising opportunity for candidates. The front runner is able to hoover up some donors from weaker performing candidates, and you get that all-important media time. So the fact this has been dragged out in such a way, and then it got knocked off the news cycle by both Trump's State of the Union address, the impeachment acquittal, and then obviously everyone having to decamp and go to New Hampshire anyway, would be very frustrating for all of the candidates who aren't Pete Buttigieg.
And the Times has an interesting poll in their piece here that shows that the New Hampshire polling, Sanders is actually starting to dip slightly. It's an area of the United States that he should be doing very well in. It's his sort of home turf up in the northeast. And yet, so he should be miles ahead, but he seems to be dipping down ever so slightly now. So it'll be a more interesting race to play when it comes around.
Yeah, he's had a great fundraising month in January. I know Bernie Sanders, hasn't he? But in terms of the overall picture, how much has this damaged all of the Democratic candidates, do you think, including, of course, Joe Biden, who's been languishing down in fourth or so place?
I mean, Joe Biden really does seem to be like America's Emily Thornberry. So picked as a front runner, seemed like the natural successor, and then suddenly, what's happened, love? Like, you've disappeared.
Right. Although these are state-by-state results. Obviously, nationally, he's still ahead. He's the #1 candidate in the national picture. He particularly does a lot better than either Pete Buttigieg or Bernie Sanders amongst African-American voters. He's associated a lot with the Obama presidency. And so the third primary, which is in North Carolina, he's expected to do very, very well in. South Carolina. He's expected to do very, very well in. It has a much higher African-American population.
And meanwhile, this is a picture editor's dream, is it not? Mr. Trump waving around a newspaper that says acquitted. He was on Trump fire,
This is why the whole impeachment saga was such a silly move for the Democrats. You have given the president a massive PR victory. He's able to wave around newspapers saying acquitted. Look at all the time that the Democrats have wasted on their phony witch hunt, and whatever the rights or wrongs of it, the PR is very, very clear. This is a win for President Trump.
I mean, you've done something terrible, which is you've forced us to agree on something. So, I mean, the planets have aligned. I think this is one of the signs of the apocalypse. But nobody wants, seemingly, Donald Trump to win the next election more than the establishment Democrats. This was a foregone conclusion because an impeachment trial fundamentally isn't really a judicial process. It's a political one. So unless you're confident of securing that all-important 2/3 Senate majority, which you aren't going to do when the Republicans enjoy quite a comfortable majority, there isn't a tremendous amount of political pressure coming from either their own base or independents, it's not going to happen. So instead, Nancy Pelosi and those other prime movers in the impeachment process have gifted Donald Trump headlines and images that he could only have dreamt of a couple of years ago.
I mean, to be fair to Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives, she had fought this off for a while. She just thought that the evidence was too strong and in the end...
But they had to backtrack quite early on. They initially started out on different charges than they ended up voting for, and that sort of moved a lot of the sort of more moderate Republicans back over to Trump's column. And from that moment on, when it was sort of vague charges of abuse of power rather than a specific charge, that's the moment that it completely disappeared. And now President Trump, in a speech tonight, has been saying, look what we could have been doing. If all of these politicians in Congress hadn't been wasting their time with impeachment, we could have been getting infrastructure done. We could have been sorting out pharmaceutical prices. And that is quite a powerful message for the next election.
It also gives him a talking point in the next election coming up, because it's quite difficult to play the same insurgent, anti-establishment card that you do after you've been in office for a few years than you did when, you were on your way in. Whereas now, after having fought off an impeachment trial, he's able to say, look, they're still out to get me. We still need to drain this swamp. And if anything, I think it's made that November campaign look like it's going to be a lot nastier than it otherwise would have been.
OK, yes. A lot further to go for the Democratic candidate, of course. Let's move on, shall we, to the news that came out of Northern Ireland, this lorry plot, ferry plot, very scary, a Brexit plot, whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't bear thinking about if it had gone off, is the headline in the Mirror.
Right, well, these are terrorists who are trying to cause an extraordinarily large loss of life. It's absolutely despicable, and thank goodness that it has been stopped. And I think the one thing that we should all remember here, because I think sometimes this debate goes off and tries to make political points. The whole point about this is we should never let people win through violent means. The terrorists win if we change policy or change the way that we act, change the way that we live, change the way that we do things because of their violence or their threats of violence. And that's the thing to remember.
So I think that there's very little appetite more generally to see the return to the kind of political violence that we saw during the Troubles. And that's because of a huge generational change after the Good Friday Agreement. You've got a generation of what's being called peace babies, for whom the salience of that sectarian division is waning. However, you do also have these demographic shifts in Northern Ireland, in particular the growth of a more Republican Catholic sentiment, which mean that you may well have huge political shifts which won't be tied to the same kind of violence that we saw in previous decades.
OK, let's move to the SNP in Scotland.
Yes.
A crisis, the Daily Mail says, for Nicola Sturgeon. She loses the person who was perhaps tipped to take over from her, which is the interesting thing, really, here, isn't it? Derek Mackay, 42, had been grooming, this paper says, a 16-year-old boy with 270 text messages.
Well, this was the charge of the leader of the acting leader of the Scottish Conservatives, who up in First Minister's questions today read out the NSPCC definition of grooming, and it sounded suspiciously like what was going on in these text messages. And this is a massive blow for the SNP, because Derek Mackay was, as you say, someone tipped to be leader, one of the best media performers, one of the most competent front bench people
on budget day as well.
And on budget day, hours before he was meant to be delivering that new budget, leaving his deputy in the lurch there. But this, again, is just such a sad, sad story, particularly for the 16-year-old child and his mother, who's been giving quotes to newspapers today saying that just how much, when she discovered these messages, how much her stomach was churning, finding that her child was being talked to in this way by a senior politician.
270 texts is really beyond the pale. That goes beyond being able to say this was just a sort of, innocent, wanting to make friends, wanting to shape a connection. I personally don't really think that someone in their 40s has much business making friends over social media with a 16-year-old, but hey, that's just me. And this is something which I think does look, really quite sleazy. I think that, as I said earlier in the show, sexual harassment isn't anything new to politics. However, social media has transformed things. It creates new avenues for making contact and new avenues for that harassment to take place. Conversely, the existence of screenshots and being able to provide hard evidence of someone's behaviour means perhaps we will see more accountability in years to come than we saw in previous decades.
OK. Plenty more still to come. Why post-Brexit Britain could see discounts on fridges and freezers. Back with that after this break. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, the senior editor at Novara Media, Ash Sarkar, and the reporter at Guido Fawkes, Tom Harwood. Great to see you both back again. Tariffs. Tell us more.
Take it away.
It doesn't sound interesting, but I genuinely love this. This is something a lot of people say, well, what's Brexit done? We've left the EU. What's that actually meant in reality? Well, this week the UK took up its seat for the first time as an independent country at the World Trade Organization. First time in 47 years that we've got our own seat up there next to America. And already the Department for International Trade under Liz Truss is going to be unilaterally now slashing tariffs on what they term as nuisance tariffs on big goods like fridges and washing machines, where the EU has previously set tariffs because Germany makes a lot of them, for example. We don't make so many of them here, so it makes much more sense for an independent UK to cut those import duties, make those goods cheaper for people in this country.
This is
and that's
taking
an
the
immediate...
level playing field argument straight to Brussels before the big talks have even started, doesn't it?
Right, but these are global tariffs, so set at the World Trade Organization are tariffs the whole wide world. We can slash that and import things from countries that we don't have any sort of deal with much, much more cheaply. And many more goods will actually be duty-free as a result of unilateral action, and that's very exciting.
Do you think the public will follow this debate over the next 11 or so months, do you think? Or has, as far as they're concerned, Friday was the big deal, it's done, we just move on now?
So one of the things that I find really interesting about Brexit is that there are two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it is that it created all these divisions in the country. Another way of looking at it is that it provided shape and colour to divisions that were already there. And it was a way for people to talk about big political values and things that they held dear, which they didn't necessarily have space to talk about before. I doubt that the nitty-gritty of trade negotiations is going to fill huge amounts of the public with the kind of vim and vigour and passion that the broad primary country...
No.
I think you
but
might be relatively alone in terms of this matter.
But when
of
goods become
However,
cheaper for people and they feel that money in their pockets, that's what matters.
Unless you want to buy German. Or is even that going to be cheaper?
Well, even that, because even if we get a comprehensive Canada-style trade agreement with the EU, then there won't be a tariff anyway. But in the event that we don't and we have something more bare bones, this is a unilateral thing for all countries, much more cheaper to import.
Let's move on to The Guardian. Coronavirus fears rise as another Briton tests positive. From outside China, they're trying to say here. The suggestion is Singapore, which means that health advice has broadened, hasn't it, for GPs and other people?
So the advice that's now been given is that if you have cold or flu-like symptoms, you should self-isolate. And the thing about coronavirus and the reason why there's been transmission outside of China is because it's got a long incubation period. It's 7 to 10 days. And in a highly integrated global society, people are moving around all the time. It provides more opportunity for contact and transmission. However, with only 3 Britons currently...
Yes, actually, the first 2 were Chinese nationals, weren't they? So this is the first Briton. I think that's what they mean. So even I was confused by saying the first there, but
3 people in Britain,
yeah.
having coronavirus. I don't think it's something for huge numbers of people to be particularly worried about. And when it comes to viral infections, how much it affects you and the sort of risk it poses to your health and to your life depends on how healthy you are generally and the availability of quality healthcare.
Last 30 seconds for Madge. I don't know which one of you chose this story, so whoever it did, take it away. What's happened to Madonna?
She had an absolute mare. She was performing at the London Palladium. She hit the cut-off point for the performance. She hadn't done her last song. The safety curtain comes down, and so Queen Madge decided to get in front of the safety curtain and perform her last song without a microphone. So bellowing like a virgin or whatever it was at the bemused
Absolutely great for the people in the first 2 rows, but I'm not sure much better for people beyond that.
Ash and Tom, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.